PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. It's Norway chess round 2, and I've got to look at the encounter between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura. For me, these are the two preeminent speed players in the world, and as Armageddon games have such an important role in this tournament, then for me, they are the two favourites. So let's see what happened. Carlsen with white. So I'm going to just go through the first few moves of the classical game. It's really funny. Hikaru Nakamura went into the confessional booth at the start of the game and he said, "My aim today is to play like an ape. Play random, simple, easy chess, nothing exciting. Don't think, just move, pretty straightforward." So, I mean, I think that's a funny description. I mean, his tongue is in his cheek. But still, I think we can see that from his style today. So, first of all, again, he plays a quirky opening system with black. Yeah, he's had a double black, actually, first two rounds. So this move, bishop c5, he played in the candidates tournament successfully against Nepo. When I say successfully, he made a draw, basically. So this classical game against Magnus today went c3. Well, that's of course, the classic response against bishop c5. You want to hit it. Game went like this, knight g6. d4, well, I mean, Magnus must have been expecting this, but he didn't come up with anything special. So here is where Nepo played bishop g5, and the game eventually ended in a draw. Magnus played rook e1. Okay, all very sensible stuff. Bishop came out, queen came out, and actually already black is, I think, doing okay because the queen is actively placed. The knight looks pretty good. If black can stabilise with moves like d6, you know, maybe they bring the bishop out here, knight f4. This is already a very nice active position. So that's why Carlsen decided to simplify. A little Zwischenzug here from black. Some exchanges, they went into an endgame, but this is a very comfortable endgame for black. Look what happened. Why is this comfortable? I mean, this is, of course, the typical Spanish exchange variation pawn structure. Notice the pawn is on e4, not e5. That's a Berlin. So, in theory, it's better to have the pawn on e4 to cover these squares. However, there is a problem for white in this position, namely the d3 square. It'd be better if that pawn were here, because after this, basically black has very easy play because there are weak light squares here, and basically, well, black has equalized this position already. So, well, the position ended in a draw after 35 moves. That was the classical game. So, a reminder of the regulations: if the classical games end in a draw, then you go into an Armageddon. Colours the same. So we had Carlsen with 10 minutes, Nakamura with 7 minutes, but Carlsen with white is in a must-win situation. Winner gets 1.5 points, loser gets 1 point. You can check out the Norway chess webpage if you want to just remind yourself of the regulations. So, Armageddon game. Remember, Nakamura is in play like an ape mode. His words, not mine. And he repeated this bishop c5 variation. Interesting. Well, I mean, Carlsen would not have had that much time to, think of something different. But he did play something different. He castled instead of playing c3. Knight e7. And now here's the difference. Instead of going for c3 and d4, Carlsen took on e5. So a very typical little tactical trick. After knight takes, you play d4, and of course you win the piece back. Nakamura throws in b5. Okay, the bishop goes back to b3. And then bishop takes d4. Black has to return the piece. So it does so like this, and that keeps the knight on quite a nice spot here on e5. Now this is an interesting moment where I can imagine a lot of people would play f4 here. It looks great, get the f-pawn going, get the rook into the game, but white isn't well developed here. And I can understand why Magnus declined to play like this, because after knight g4 it starts to get a bit tricky. You know, imagine a scenario like this where suddenly we can see why it's a disadvantage to advance that f-pawn, because the e-pawn is weaker. You can see that black can put a lot of pressure on that e-pawn, and it's very hard to get this attack going. I mean, actually black's pieces are absolutely beautiful here. So Carlsen was more restrained and simply played bishop f4. Very sensible, very prudent. Better to play with your pieces than your pawns, particularly if you're not developed properly. Now the queen came all the way back. Bishop b7, so this bishop finds a nice diagonal. Rook e1, probably more accurate to play bishop c2. We'll see why in a second. Yeah, Nakamura at this point played in a bit of a routine way. Now, he played queen c7. I think this is the problem if you're just playing very, very quickly. He could have played like this, attacking the bishop. Remember, if white gives up the bishop pair, if he gives up that dark square bishop, I don't think black has any difficulties. And after this, queen f6, and then knight f4, those knights look pretty good. So I would say Carlsen might have to give up that bishop for the knight, and then it must be just equal. But queen c7 played. Now watch what happens. Bishop c2, rook d8. So Carlsen manages to develop the queen side. That's important. And then queen h5. So these pieces looking pretty good now. And it's not exactly clear what black is doing. You know, you would quite like to break with f5, but you know, white's pieces are beautifully set up for that. The bishop as well. Rook e8, rook d1. You can see white has control here. Bishop came back. c4. Now, Nakamura hits upon a plan. Knight f1. Now, if black waits around, if you play a kind of half move, then white is going to throw that knight in to d5 or f5, and that's a beautiful position for white. And don't forget that f-pawn. Once white's pieces are developed, then it's okay to advance the f-pawn. But yeah, even before then, you know, it's this knight coming into the game that really would squash black's pawn breaks and looks really nice. So Nakamura played it in a really pragmatic way, actually. It's interesting. He wanted clarity. He doesn't want to wait around. So he initiates exchanges with knight d3. Well, that's an octopus. Beautiful piece. It has to go. Carlsen exchanged, took the pawn, and then rook takes e4. So Nakamura has just initiated some exchanges, but there's no doubt he's a little bit worse here. His structure is worse. Now, little trick. Don't take on d6, because that's a loose piece, and black could play bishop takes g2, queen c6, you pick up the bishop, and that's check. Black might even be slightly better there. No, so we don't take the pawn, but instead rook d4. Now here's an interesting moment. Again, it's one of those moments where maybe Nakamura should have just thought a little bit longer. You know, you could just defend that bishop. Now it looks a little bit funny because that bishop gets pushed around, but actually it's pretty safe here. And even putting on a2, it's very hard to get at that bishop, and it might well bounce around to a good square. In the meantime, watch that knight. This knight could come around here. Yeah, white is slightly better. You know, there's a nice blockade on d4, and perhaps this knight is coming here. But once this knight switches round, I mean, this is the kind of position that's very typical of the French defence, actually, the Tarrasch variation, where black often dislodges a piece from the blockading square d4, and this isolated pawn really isn't a problem at all. In fact, black's pieces can become active. But instead, he put the bishop back on b7. Queen d1, some pressure here. So once more, if Nakamura wants to kind of sit tight, try and hold everything together, you could play d5. Looks a bit funny with that bishop blocked in, but actually can't really win that pawn. And what is white doing actually? This is not easy. And you can imagine a scenario where black could exchange knights, and then we're getting closer to a draw with opposite colour bishops. I think this one is harder to defend, but still, it is an option. But instead, again, Nakamura being very pragmatic, he's doing his random, simple, easy chess, and just played h6. Didn't want to defend that pawn. Just thought, okay, I'll give it up, and, you know, my pieces are quite nice. But this is a clear pawn. It's difficult to convert this because if the knights are exchanged, then black is getting close to a draw. So can Nakamura achieve that? I mean, it's difficult to convert this, particularly if you're short of time. Let's have a look. b3. Ah, okay, a plan emerges for white. Of course. Create a pass pawn on the queen side. Knight e7. Okay, alert. This knight may be able to come to f5 to exchange. Watch out for the pin, but still, the knight is entering the game on perhaps one of these squares. A check, very sound. If king g8, then white can make some progress. Nakamura played queen g6. How wise was this? Of course, he's thinking if I exchange queens, then, you know, it could be closer to that drawn endgame if he can exchange knights. But not so simple. Okay, knight d5. Nakamura desperate to exchange. But there's no need. Carlsen just dropped back. And then the king marched over. In fact, white's pieces are beautifully placed here. Notice how that bishop controls some key squares, including f4. That knight is not going to break in. And what's white's plan? White's plan is really simple. It can just march into black's position, and these pawns are vulnerable. Let's see what happened. King f7. The king came forward. There's nothing that black can do about this. It just went all the way. It's a classic king march. Nothing black can do here. Okay, now let's create a passed pawn. Nakamura trying to start some kind of squeeze on the king side, but actually there's no need for white to get involved in anything that's going on there. Just keep going. I mean, if bishop c8, after this move, black can barely move. That's a lovely move. Bishop can't move. Pawn can't move. Well, actually, it could advance, but it'll drop off soon. But these pieces can't move. The knight can move, but that would allow a knight into d5. I mean, it's utterly lost. Nakamura played bishop c6. Bishop came back. And then h3. So this little shuffle was to make sure that there was absolutely no counterplay with h3. And then he can turn his attention around here. That's another weak pawn. Can't be defended. f5, that got taken. And don't forget, on the other side of the board, the king grabs a6. So at this moment, Carlsen is 3 pawns up. He can simply bring the king back to b6, and this is coming really soon. It's utterly lost. I mean, in fact, both these pawns are vulnerable as well. Once one drops, the next one will. So in this position, understandably, Hikaru Nakamura resigned. The whole play like an ape routine, as Nakamura described his play, well, it worked very well in the classical game. But I feel that Nakamura didn't show his best chess in this Armageddon game. You know, there were a couple of moments where if he played more accurately, I think he'd have held this one. You know, there was no need to give up that pawn on d6. He could, I think this is the clearest one, d5. And I think this is absolutely tenable for black, this position. It needs a bit of grit, but I think, you know, Nakamura is a very good technical player. I think, you know, on another day he could have held that. So anyway, a good victory for Magnus Carlsen, who now leads the tournament with 2 Armageddon wins. All the classical games were drawn today. So we had 3 Armageddon games. Ding won his Armageddon game, which I'm delighted about actually, and Firuzja defeated Caruana. So Ding defeated Pragnanandit, Firuzja defeated Caruana in the Armageddon game. All interesting stuff, but at the moment, Magnus Carlsen looking good. Don't forget, got a live broadcast on Friday evening, 8 PM UK time. Do join me. I'll be discussing this very entertaining and very instructive book, Zwischenzug, with the authors Natasha Regan and Matt Ball. Do join me Friday, 8 PM UK.